What is the greatest correlation to AI overviews? Brand mentions across the web. According to Ahrefs, who analyzed 75,000 brands, brand mentions across the web are what drive AI overviews. In other words, what the internet says about you now matters more than what's on your website. But here's the challenge. Many companies ranking on Google still aren't showing up in ChatGPT or AI overviews at all. So if your SEO strategy still revolves around backlinks and on-site optimization, you might be invisible to where buyers are actually searching. I'm Jordan Cooney, and joining me today is Rahul Jain, CEO and co-founder at Noble, an AI search platform that helps brands get mentioned in sources like large language models through actual citations. Today, Rahul and I are going to talk about why brand mentions are replacing backlinks as the currency of AI search visibility, how Noble reached 1 million in ARR in just 4 months after pivoting into AI search, and what it actually takes to get your brand cited in LLMs like ChatGPT and Claude. Rahul, welcome to the Voice of Search podcast.
Cool. Thanks, Jordan. Great to be on, and I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, same here. I'm thrilled to connect on the show. Obviously, we've been talking for many months as you first started, building up Noble and getting the brand off the ground, getting your services and your offering into the market. I'd love to just have you tell your story. Like, how did you get into the AI discovery space? How did you get into the SEO space? I love it because there's a whole bunch of new, innovative people who are entering this industry and are doing so from backgrounds that aren't the traditional SEO quote unquote route.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first time we met, one of the first things you said to me is like, you don't have an SEO background, do you? And we don't. Like, we very much enter this space from a different approach. So my co-founder, Josh, and I, we started Noble about 2 years ago. And we were really focused on how people were making purchasing decisions. Like, how are people buying? And the initial idea behind Noble when we started the company was, there was so much noise, especially in the B2B space, that we thought there would be a way for people to buy where they could just ask their friends for recommendations. So if you're evaluating a product or a service, the first version of Noble was just a banner on a brand or vendor's website that said, want to see who you know that uses this product. And then, the buyer clicks that button and then they see which of their friends or colleagues or LinkedIn connections are actually users. So that's how we started Noble about 2 years ago. We had some initial success there, but ultimately ran into legal and privacy problems as we were scaling it because we needed a customer list from the vendor in order to power that experience. As we were, kind of working on that initial idea, one thing was becoming really apparent that while people will always talk to their friends to get recommendations, people were leaning towards ChatGPT and Google's AI overview and AI mode and these LLMs to get answers and advice and recommendations, even before they were asking their friends or people that they knew for advice and recommendations. And more importantly, like, we were selling to marketers, and every marketer I was talking to was like, their number one priority was trying to figure out how to show up in these LLMs, because a lot of them were ranking on the first page of Google, but they weren't showing up in the answers for the prompts that they cared about. So we kept hearing this pain point over and over around, word of mouth is nice, but we're just focused on AI search right now. Like, that's a higher priority for us. And I think the part of the reason we ended up pivoting was we also could see it in our own buying behavior, where I was reaching out and I was using ChatGPT and Google's AI overview and AI mode much more than I was before. It kind of became the default for me. And I think that for me, it was like kind of the trigger when I see myself using a product or a service over and over, and I'm not typically a super early adopter. And I was like, okay, there's clearly something that's happening here in the market. And, we've grown up with search, but this is a completely new experience that I think is really exciting that we're going to, get to kind of live through.
I love it. And I think it's really special that, you came at this from one angle, one problem, a very genuine one that is trying to help brands better connect. And then you've moved into this discovery phase where marketers are essentially trying to solve this pain point on how to be seen and recognized. One of the topics that you and I have talked about as we've gotten to know each other is this concept of citation gap,
Sure.
and the citation gap between Google rankings and AI answers. As we learn more about what Noble does, I'd love to start off by just having you share a little bit of knowledge and information about what the citation gap is and what that means in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you go to ChatGPT, when you go to Google and you effectively just type in that search prompt, what's happening behind the scenes is that these LLMs essentially have training data that they're using. They have essentially snippets that they've accumulated, and then there's RAG. And so what they're doing is they're essentially looking at these little chunks of information or data that can best answer that prospect's question. And so what's happening behind the scenes is that they're taking that data that the LLMs have and they're synthesizing it and they're trying to create an answer that answers that prospect's question to the best of their abilities. We don't know exactly all the inputs that go into that data set that the LLMs are using, but the hypothesis we had behind Noble, with now some data behind it, was that the citations that the LLMs provide must be somehow related to the information that's ultimately presented as far as the sources that they're getting this information from. It's not like a typical like a journal where it's like every word is cited and you know where the information comes from. Typically for a research prompt, there's about 10 to 15 sources or citations that are provided. There are many other pieces of information that these LMs are pulling from, but one thing that we do have pretty significant confidence in is that the sources are a meaningful input into
Yeah.
that answer. There's
Yeah.
definitely a lot of other information that is evaluated, that is part of the model, but we have seen specifically with some of the sources that there's a lot of like direct relationship where the specific wording in the sources is actually then showing up in the answers that you're seeing for some of those sources provided. And we'll get more to what Noble does, but we've also seen that when you get your brand mentioned in the sources being cited by the LLMs for those search prompts, you then start showing up in the answers as
Yes.
well. So
So
that
let's
was a big
yeah.
hypothesis going into this.
No, and I want to talk about kind of where that hypothesis has gone to where the industry is today, because the industry now is unfolding into better understanding how LLM models work, right? In particular, the concept of what's happening in a model from a training perspective versus what's happening in a model in a grounding perspective. And I'd love to get your understanding of your perspective on how each of those factors into the citations used by the model to then determine what they're going to use to create the response.
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is definitely one that I would typically defer to my co-founder Josh, who's like the ML expert on our team. So like,
Hey, we're gonna have to do the 2-person interview next, so we'll just have to hold off on getting Josh on
if
here.
you want like the true answer from the expert, I would ask Josh for this type of question. But generally speaking, what we've seen is that for the sources themselves, they are what we've seen as like kind of the best just kind of suggestion or the best area to focus on because you get specific articles that the LLMs are actually citing for a certain search prompt.
Mhm.
There are definitely many other articles that are and sources that are contributing to that answer, but nobody knows everything else that goes into that answer that the LLMs are essentially analyzing kind of behind the scenes, whether it's in the training data or any of the other data that's analyzing. So all we can say with some confidence is that the sources are a good place to start because while they're actually created after the fact, they're almost like a UI that's created where, okay, they've created it, they've given this answer. And then after the fact, they actually cite these sources to justify the
Mhm.
answer.
Mhm.
We have seen that even though it's kind of a reversal, it's not your typical, okay, well, here are the sources and then here's the answer. It's the other way around where it provides the answer and then it shows sources to kind of justify the answer. Still getting into those sources does impact the answer itself. So it's not purely just from a UI perspective. We do have high confidence that some of those sources or articles are actually influencing the answers
Right.
themselves.
Right, absolutely. And I think this is one of those areas that we're going to only continue to see more knowledge and research around, which is, how are these models creating preference over the core foundation of what they have in training versus how they're using either grounding or newer ways of accessing insight and data, whether it be through data pipelines like agentic commerce protocol, or an MCP, a layer of data that's being shared with one of these models. even within these contained elements, there's going to be citations, right? There's going to be linkable citations, ones that actually have links to brands, and then ones that don't. And that leads me to the last question on this section, which is like, what is your perception of that value, and how is it uniquely different between having the link or just being mentioned and seen in source data or content?
Yeah. So this goes back to kind of what is that buyer behavior? So when most buyers are searching on Google and they see the overview that pops up, or they're searching on ChatGPT, they're just looking at the answer that's provided. They're not digging into the citations and clicking on those links. For the most part, the vast majority of people are going to use the answers presented to them as the complete answer. And so that gets to the kind of question of like, well, what's more valuable? Is it being the source that's being cited, so that link that's presented, or is it actually just being in the answer that the LLMs are provided? And it's very clear from just user behavior, buyer behavior, that you just want to show up in the answer.
Yeah.
And I think when you think of a traditional SEO, it's all about traffic to the website. So I think when people see a link presented as a source, like, oh, great, people are going to click on that link and they're going to come to our website. While that does happen, like it's not like a complete zero, it's a very small percentage of users. So ultimately what you want is you actually want to be, your brand wants to be, you want to get your brand mentioned in the sources that the LLMs are citing, so that you can show up in the answer that your prospects are reading versus being the citation itself. And so it's something that's probably counterintuitive, because I think for most like SEOs, most marketers, it's always been traffic to your website. And so if there's something clickable, it's like, oh, I definitely want to be that article that people come to my website and then they discover my product, or they read more about us. But when it comes to just buyer behavior, you want to be in the answer. And the best way to be in the answer is just to have your brand mentioned in the source versus actually having the citation itself lead back to your website.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, maybe my last question on this point here is that, as mentions becomes the new commodity in the discovery space, circumventing kind of backlinks, I'm kind of curious to get your perspective on, does it make a difference in terms of value? Does the backlink lose value in its purpose, or is it just that it's more about recognizing what the user needs and wants and ensuring that you're covering that in order to be present?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there's two ways to kind of look at this question. One is from a backlink versus brand mention perspective. And I think there's another way to look at it, which is like an affiliate link versus a brand perspective. So
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
talk about those two different topics. So from a backlink perspective, backlinks are great for rankings. But if you believe that the future is just answers provided in not ranking a specific link, kind of traditional like 10 blue links from Google, then the backlink like itself doesn't really matter as much. It's about the copy. These large language models care about the copy that's in these articles, so they can provide the best answer to the prospects who are searching. The fundamental difference between a backlink and a brand mention is that today, if you're trying to rank higher in Google, you want a backlink from a website that has a higher domain authority than you. And there's really just an infinite amount of websites out there that have a higher domain authority than you. With brand mentions, if you look at a prompt, there's only about 10 to 15 sources that are provided. And so it's highly, highly targeted. So instead of going out and being like, okay, well, I just need to get a backlink from a company in like the same industry, so it's somewhat relevant, but has a higher domain authority, there's a ton of those out there. Whereas when you look at a brand mention, it is incredibly more difficult to get that, because there's only 10 to 15 sources per search prompt that you know with confidence that if you go after, you'll be more likely to show up in the answer. So that's the kind of the first fundamental difference, is that it's highly targeted in the source or the article, versus a backlink is very broad in terms of where you can get that backlink from. The second thing is actually the name itself. The link itself doesn't matter as much when it comes to LLMs. It's all about the copy and the way that your product, your company, your service is actually positioned in that article. So, while I can't say that the link doesn't matter at all, I think there is some benefit to the link itself. It's more so about the copy and how your product or service is actually described in the article. So, I think when people talk about brand mentions, I think it's natural to think about backlinks, but I think it's more about long tail PR than it is about a backlink itself, because the link itself doesn't matter. It's about getting mentioned in
Yes.
specific sources. So I kind of think long tail PR is the better kind of equivalent than looking at this as like the new generation of backlinks.
And I love this because I think this is where we transition our
Mhm.
industry from being this kind of, fishing and pecking at backlinks across the internet to a understanding the context and the meaning and the purpose of why and where and how a brand is mentioned. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but there's a lot to that because it really encapsulates the story behind what and how your brand is represented online. And that's what leads me to my next question is that, Rahul, you and I, we have a unique story. We are both grew up in northern Wisconsin, you in central Wisconsin, I in northeastern Wisconsin. We both come from, minority backgrounds. And that's pretty uncommon for all of you who don't know northern Wisconsin. That is not the standard up there by any stretch of the imagination. But now we're both here in the Bay Area. We're both working in this new AI discovery space, and you've had some phenomenal success. So I'm super happy that another person with a very similar background to me is having phenomenal success in building Noble. You guys have achieved over $1 million in revenue in ARR in just 4 months, as you've pivoted into this AI search space. And I really want to get your perspective on what success looks like to you and your team, Josh, your co-founder, and how you're measuring success for the business as you guys continue to invest in developing your product and servicing your clients.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Great question. And yeah, this has been, when you pivot as a startup, you have no idea what's on the other side of this. So when we pivoted last summer, we had a few months of runway left. And so it really was this last ditch effort. We're not SEO people. So it's not like we came at this with a ton of information. Like I didn't even know at the time you could edit an article that was on the internet. So the fact that you quit and have the author edit it or change it or update it, like that was new to me.
Oh,
I also learned how much of the internet is pay to play, which I was
yeah.
not familiar with at the time. But I think when it comes to success, I mean, part of the reason that Noble has grown so quickly is I think this is just a problem that every marketer cares about. And we grew up with search. When I have a problem, one of the first things I do is I Google it to try to understand the problem better. I see what it's out there. So the fact that search is changing it's such a great opportunity because I feel like people just naturally they go to Google, which is still by far the largest LLM out there with the AI overview. And the fact that that's changing and there is a new opportunity to help brands show up, like that's an incredible, like just like timing that we have in the market that founders and entrepreneurs, like they dream of that. Like anytime that
Yeah.
you're raising money, one of the first questions that the VCLs ask you is like, well, why now? Why does this matter today and didn't matter a year ago? And that we have the easiest answers here with these LLMs where they weren't around before. And now that it's become very clear that like Google's AI overview is showing up in more of the answers, I think there's a path to the AI mode becoming the default very soon. Like this is the new way of searching. And even for me, like when I search and I see links, I search again because I don't want to click on links. I just want an answer. Or go to ChatGPT from using Google. And so like I think part of the reason that we've been able to grow so quickly, even with just an MVP product, is because this is a problem that marketers have and they're trying to figure out, which is just like, how do I show up in the LLMs? And like that has more to do with kind of our success and growth than the product or the team or anything. It's just like it's a very relevant problem that
Yeah.
people want to solve. So that's kind of what I'll kind of just like start with in terms of like why we've seen this growth.
Yeah.
In terms of success, there's kind of like how we measure success today and how we talk about that in the future. Today, it's all about just showing up in the LLM. So visibility is the
Yeah.
ultimate metric. And so it's not about like the brand mention. That's kind of the direct endpoint for Noble, but the indirect value is ultimately like you get mentioned in these sources that Noble will help you with. And then the value of that is then showing up in the answers that prospects are searching. And so we have like, luckily, like we've had some great customers. We have some really good data that I'm happy to share around once you get into these sources, how much more likely are you to show up in the answers or the prompts that the brand cares about? So that's kind of the primary metric today that we look at, which is how much more often, or what is that visibility score increase for, for brands? So that's kind of the ultimate endpoint today. I think if we're talking 6 to 12 months from now, it'll actually be either demos booked from the LLM, or it'll be actually like purchases. Um, I think it's, becoming very clear that within these LLMs, especially like ChatGPT, there's going to be like apps that brands can create where you can book a demo directly from the
Yeah.
LLM.
Yeah.
Google's also enabling agents on their end. So I think the infrastructure isn't there quite yet for attribution. And that's why people today are just focused on visibility. I guess kind of this like top of funnel metric, like, am I just showing up in the prompts? But I think very quickly that's going to turn into, okay, our visibility is X%, but last week we've booked 500 demos
Yeah.
from Google or from ChatGPT directly. And then you have pure attribution. The problem today is like, people will say, oh, there's only like 2% of traffic from the LLM, but that completely disregards the largest LLM, which is Google and the AI overview. Like the
Exactly.
attribution is
Exactly.
complete crap
Yeah. Yeah.
today,
Yeah. Yeah.
but like as these LLMs, look to just sell ads
Yeah.
against the search, like they're going to provide better infrastructure to measure like what people are searching and then who's booking a demo directly from the LLM. And that's when I think this category is going to actually explode. I think we're still in the very early days, but when brands and marketers realize that their competitors are booking demos before they even get to that brand's website and they're losing from just the search itself, then I think you're going to see a much bigger investment in
Right.
these LLMs. And I actually think it could turn into a performance category, whereas today it's more of like a brand marketing play.
It's very heavily a brand marketing play. And I
Mhm.
think this is where I get a lot of questions from, business owners, executives. How do you get something new into these LLMs? Because I think that's one of the most critical milestones. You've done it with Noble. You've taken a company from nothing to something very quickly here. And you guys should be really proud of that. But there aren't a lot of examples of this in the marketplace that showcase how you do that exclusively through the ecosystem of AI discovery. And there's a lot of brands that have done this in search. There's a lot of brands that have done this with social media. There's a lot of brands who've used brand marketing, but AI discovery as a channel
Mhm.
for net new growth is still somewhat uncharted. Tell us more about what you think is required to be successful as a brand new company brand website in AI discovery.
So if you're a brand new company, like, and this is the exciting part, is that like in the kind of SEO, 10 blue link days, like it'd be impossible to compete with the
Mm-hmm.
incumbent. Now it's like, imagine you had the ability to do SEO in the early 2000s when Google was just launching. Like that's the opportunity today. So that smaller brand can actually get out ahead of that larger incumbent and start showing up for search prompts that they wouldn't even rank on the first page of Google before. And so
Yep.
I think it really is kind of this time and place where if you are willing to take a bet, because nothing is really guaranteed because everything is so early, but if you're willing to make like a calculated bet, and again, like everything with AEO, GEO, it's just good SEO at the end of the day. So like it's
Yeah.
not mentally different. But if you are willing to do the things like offsite mentions, and really I think the biggest difference like AEO and traditional SEO is really a lot of the offsite work that's being done. But when it comes to making those early bets, I think now is a great opportunity where if you want to show up in the AI overview and AI mode in ChatGPT, like you can get ahead of those incumbents because a lot of them are still trying to figure out how this works. We're talking to a lot of those bigger brands, kind of those Fortune 500 companies, those enterprises, and they're just at the visibility tracking stage.
Yeah.
They're just trying to figure out how often they show up. They're not at the action and intervention stage yet. So I think if you are a startup, I think if you are like a Series A, Series B company, I think there's a great opportunity today. And you do have to take a bit of a risk where nothing is really guaranteed. There's no playbook built yet, but that's where the opportunity is because once everybody starts doing the same thing, it becomes incredibly expensive and difficult to stand out. So, if you're an early stage company, I would highly recommend, there's a lot of different interventions depending on like what part of the funnel that you're looking at and try to optimize for. But I think this is an opportunity just in general where you can get out ahead of
Right.
the incumbent in your space because they're just gonna be slow to
Yeah.
move. essentially as like any bigger company
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. All right, I want to pivot more to some of the kind of the functional pieces of what you guys are building and doing around Noble. And one of the things that I want to go to is that there's a lot of confusion in the marketplace as to what these activities are. And I want to understand from your perspective and your experience how the offering of Noble to gain citations and the purpose and what a functional citation is differs or is the same to traditional PR, and how you may want to or not focus on major publications like the New York Times or Forbes or others in order to gain that citation ecosystem of value in order to show up in responses. And so just tell us a little more about how this differs to traditional PR, and then what is the actual benchmark that you need to be thinking about when it comes to making a decision as to where to invest in either brand mentions or traditional PR?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we're almost seeing this new ecosystem form and this new like version of PR where I think you have traditional PR, which is going after like the top tier publishers for like net new articles that they're writing about you. I think there's your kind of your PR news wires that are essentially kind of blasting out like blog posts or articles and trying to syndicate them. I think you have your old like affiliate networks that are trying to kind of create content. Like there's all these like legacy offsite motions
Yeah.
today.
Yeah.
And what's actually needed for LLMs is a bit different from everything else that exists out there. And all those other incumbents that have been around for 5 or 10 years are all trying to pivot into AI search. But I think you've really got to understand the nuance associated with AI search to really kind of perform well. And the best way I can look at this is the LLMs at least give you some blueprint of what you should focus on by looking at the citations behind the searches, because that's the only thing we really have today with a level of confidence that these citations are provided for a certain search prompt. And so those articles must influence the answer that's provided, or like we've definitely seen that correlation. Um, in terms of like the difference between each one of those categories. So we're traditional PR. So you think about getting your brand mentioned in an article written in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or Forbes or Fortune. Like that's great from like, almost like a vanity perspective of like, yes, like our CEO's name or his quote or her quote is in this top tier publication. But those sources are those like publications typically aren't cited by the LLM. And a lot of reasons that they aren't is one that like a lot of them block the LLMs so they
Yep.
can't crawl their content. And the other part of it is like, let's say you're a B2B company, like how often is the New York Times really talking about your product or category? Like very rarely, or like the Wall Street Journal. So it is not typically something that they talk about a lot from a commercial perspective. Um, Whereas like when you look at the citations that these LLMs are providing, they're almost like a long tail PR. It's these blogs and listicles and kind of articles written. And they're sites that you probably have never heard about before, but
Yeah.
that's where you really need to focus. And so so that's kind of one category, which is the just traditional PR. When you think about the affiliates, so there was kind of a hypothesis before. They're like, oh, we have this big affiliate network. Let's go after those affiliates. But what we found is that those affiliates also are not cited by the LLMs.
Yep.
And so there's a lot of companies trying to kind of take their affiliate network and promote it, saying like, hey, we have access to thousands of authors and publishers. But if those authors and publishers are not being cited by the LLMs with their existing articles, then it's not really that helpful from an LLM perspective for the prompts you care about. And then there's the third category around like PR newswires. And these are interesting because like, we partner with one of these companies, or we have, we're very friendly with Stacker, for example.
Yeah.
And they have found that like when you can essentially syndicate an article, that article gets cited often, which is great from a citation like link perspective that like we were talking about earlier, but it just depends on your goal. If you're trying to get in the citation so that people potentially open up like the sources and they click on it, great. That's super helpful there, but it may not help you get directly mentioned in the answer itself. So those are kind of what I would say the kind of the three legacy motions around like offsite. So you have traditional kind of tier one publications, you have affiliate networks, and then you have like PR newswires
Yeah.
that syndicate content. So I think that's kind of the like what exists today. And then I can talk about Noble in a second. But let me kind of pause there and see if that makes sense.
It makes a ton of sense. And I think that not only for our listeners, but I think generally speaking, the market is very curious because you said this earlier that this entire AI discovery ecosystem is very heavily skewed towards brand and brand positioning. And when you think about your positioning your brand, you typically think of traditional PR. And so, do you think of traditional PR as an accelerator of clarifying what your brand is and how your brand works inside of LLMs? Do you think of it as complementary? Do you think of it as competitive to the citation work that Noble can do, or the citation work that we are uncovering as a vehicle to improve your AI discovery?
Yeah, I definitely think it's complementary to even like the work that Noble does. So like the difference, just to kind of be very
Yeah,
explicit about this, that if you're traditional PR, you probably have even an internal PR and comms team, or you're working with a PR agency. They have relationships with typically like tier one publishers. So it's like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Fortune. There might be some like industry specific publications. Those are great to get mentioned in just in general. But the challenge is that if the LLMs are not pulling from that source, it's not going to help you with search and showing
yeah,
up in the answer. The difference is what Noble does is we will take the prompts, we'll run the prompts, and we'll see what the sources are behind those search prompts you want to show up in. And then for every single source or citation, we'll identify who the author or the publisher is. We'll reach out to them. We'll build a relationship with them, and then we'll work to get you mentioned in those sources. So I kind of like to think about Noble as almost like a long tail PR, where it's a very similar motion that your internal PR team or PR agency is doing, but they, 99.9% of them do not have relationships with the sources that are being cited by the LLM because there's very little overlap in the sources cited and kind of the tier one
yeah.
publications that they're used to going after. I was kind of surprised that when we kind of first started looking at this, that Noble like kind of felt more under the SEO bucket than it did under the PR bucket because I really kind of looked at this as long tail PR.
Yeah.
And I think it's an opportunity that PR agencies and internal comms teams could take advantage of more. But SEO teams have definitely jumped on this quicker.
Yeah, let's talk about that because I think a big driver of that transition to connecting with, say, SEO agencies or SEOs in the market, I believe it largely has to do with our ability to create clear measurement, right?
Mhm.
SEO has always been in a position to justify its existence through some form of measurement. And it's not to say that PR doesn't, but it is certainly a very different approach to thinking about performance and output, right? Many marketers, many CMOs think of SEO as a performance marketing channel. And it inherently is not. It
Mhm.
can be, but it's
Yeah.
totally a chameleon and it can operate in a variety of different functions depending on how a company wants to leverage SEO and use SEO. So let's talk about measurement and let's talk about what is the right attribution for AI search.
Mhm. Yeah. So today, I think the right metric to look at is visibility. Like how much or how often are you showing up in the LLMs? We like looking at like a visibility score or mention rate, which is just of the prompts you care about, what percentage of them are you mentioned in the answer? So your brand shows up in the answer provided. You can also look at kind of share of voice, which is you against your competitors to see like for companies in the same space, who shows up more. But I think ultimately just kind of taking a step back, I think just visibility is the right metric to look at today and how you should measure success. I do think once you have more agents, like, and you are able to build a way to book a demo directly from the LLM, or there's a better way to check out if you're kind of a B2C product, I think that's going to be the ultimate metric. It's going to be actual transactions and conversions, because obviously the closer you can get to revenue, kind of, the better everything is in terms of like a success. But today, I think that the right metric to look at is measuring visibility.
And so let's talk about visibility for a second. Like one of the big questions I hear from the industry perpetually is that historically when SEOs created keyword ranking tracking, they had some level of data some degree of confidence in the keywords they were choosing, largely because when many of those systems were first being adopted, there was a ton of paid search data that was being funneled from Google to marketers. There's a whole bunch of insights being given in terms of what were the actual search terms used inside of Google through either Google passing that in the URL or other sources. So there was like, without question, real fact about what a good keyword to track is.
Right.
Today, in AI visibility, it's really hard to know what the prompt is. So how do we get to a place where we can confidently agree on what a prompt is and how that prompt should be included or not included in visibility as a metric?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think right now it's like everybody's best guess at what these prompts are. The companies that use clickstream data that think that they know what people are, actually searching, I don't think it's reliable at all. I think it's heavily biased data. Like anytime you can pay somebody for their search history, that's probably not your buyer.
Exactly.
No, but I do think eventually we'll get to the point where these LLMs do provide us some guidance on what people are searching and what those volumes are,
Yep.
especially if they're trying to sell ads against it. But I think right now, like the best thing is to, work with the marketing team, work with the sales team to be like, well, what types of questions do you guys get on your sales calls? Like, what do you think your prospects are asking? And kind of work backwards from there. So, fortunately, kind of we're so early that's kind of like guess and check right now. That I do think eventually that data will be provided by the LLMs themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely an evolution here in terms of how we get to that prompt level data. From your perspective, and specifically to the concept of citations, though, and the ability to be seen or recognized within other sources online as a recognized either brand or a recognized product. How do you think about the fact that you can understand your brand to some degree with visibility, and going back to this brand focus of ensuring that your brand is clearly articulated in the LLMs? How much are you emphasizing that territory for established companies in order to measure and understand visibility as well as the value of, say, a citation online?
Yeah, even with established companies, so a lot of our customers today are enterprises. So they've been around for 10, 20 years.
Mhm.
And they always have like their core product that's just like kind of well known. So if you think about like Salesforce CRM, like everybody knows Salesforce for a CRM, but they have many other products as well. And so they're trying to increase the visibility of those other product lines that may not be as well known. From like a growth stage startup perspective, think about a company like Ramp. Everybody knows Ramp for their corporate card, but they have 5 total product lines. And so it's like, if you're Ramp, it's like, yes, you have the corporate card that everybody knows about. How many people know about the procurement offering or the treasury offering or the other offerings that Ramp has, for example? So even these larger companies, they have a lot of room for growth in terms of visibility on their kind of their non-core product because they're still trying to sell that product. The other thing that's really interesting about companies that have been around for a while is that I kind of like to make the analogy that like when you pivoted before, you just changed the messaging on your website, and that would typically be enough. With LLMs, it's all about who is talking about you. So you've pretty much got to update the rest of the internet if you're changing positioning or pricing or like messaging or anything around your product itself, like especially like a rebrand. And so with the LLM, not only is it about getting net new mentions in the sources, it's about going back to the sources that are already mentioning you and making sure that you're mentioned the way you want to get mentioned. So if you change your positioning or your messaging or your pricing or you've rebranded, somebody has to go back and reach out to those authors and those publishers and be like, hey, you previously mentioned us as X, can we change that so it looks like Y? Because that's more accurate. So that's another part of like the outreach that needs to be done today, where it's not just about how do I show up in these sources where I'm not showing up today, but it's also about, okay, I am showing up today. This is being cited, but it's not the way I want to show up. And so who's going to do that work of actually kind of refreshing that mention?
Yeah, and you brought up something that I think is super important, kind of our last theme or topic for our show, which is maybe one of the meatiest and
Mhm.
one of the most um, sought after topics right now in the industry, which is listicles.
Mhm.
And what we've seen is that listicles, not too dissimilar to say Reddit being a source, has seen this kind of accelerant in kind of hype and excitement and as a resource to become more visible in AI responses, right? And so as we chase these responses, these zero sum positions, right? Because it's not rankings, it's just one response.
Yeah.
What I've noticed over the last 12 months is that the industry, whether it be SEO, PR, others, have really latched on and gravitated towards how LLMs are maybe favoring specific types of experiences,
Yeah.
community-based content in the Reddit example,
Mhm.
listicles as a resource most recently. So
Yeah.
how are you thinking about those factors of these kind of cyclical waves where either training data or in some capacity grounding is being levered as a primary resource inside of the model's ability to formulate a response? And how are you then either educating or curving the appetite to ensure that there's a longevity to the
Yeah.
tactics that you may use in channels like a Reddit or listicle mentions and placements?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I don't want to say it's like the flavor of the month right now, but ultimately these LLMs care about providing the best answer to that person who's searching. And so I wouldn't get overly focused on, okay, Reddit as a channel, Wikipedia as a channel, Quora, listicles, YouTube. Like those are all different channels and they're going to, increase and decrease in terms of those citations. I think you just have to have a way to get mentioned on places other than your website. And if that's the level that you're looking at this, which is just purely like, hey, I need to have a strategy so that my brand can get mentioned in these sources, regardless of what format they come in, that's going to make you succeed. I wouldn't overly focus on just listicles, just Reddit, anything like that, because there's so much is going to change. We can be talking we could be talking a year from now, all Reddit could be gone in terms of the citations. But if you have a motion in place that figures out what the LLMs deem as the most valuable and you get your brand mentioned there, that's what matters versus like what is the specific type of content that we want to go after.
Love it. I think this is one of the big challenges that we have in the market today is creating clarity around diversification. And that
Mm.
diversification is absolutely imperative to any brand success in AI models because as they evolve and they change, they're going to be utilizing and consuming new sources as not necessarily primary, but as a more complete picture of what's happening for a brand on web. So let's transition to my favorite part of the show. I'm going to jump into our lightning round. I'm going to give you 5 different questions from today's episode,
Mm.
and I'd love for you to give me a quick response around each of these topics. So here we go. You ready?
Love it. Let's do it.
Okay. Before you started Noble, you were selling healthcare to enterprises. And how and what is different about your pitch now to marketing leaders, specifically around making AI attribution clear?
Oh my gosh. It's light and day or night and day from like selling into healthcare. Everything is just so much faster. There's less regulation. People are more willing to take risks. But um, the pitch is that if you're not focused on showing up today, if you wait until the attribution is there, it's going to take you a year or so to actually show up. So you've got to get ahead. It's very clear kind of where the puck is going to be. And so you've got to get there today. Otherwise, you're going to be behind the eight ball
Yeah.
when the time comes and the attribution is there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, I think, one of the key ones, which is a
Mhm.
great segue to my second question. If AI search traffic barely shows up in analytics today,
Okay.
why should any SEO or any marketing team invest right now?
I don't think the analytics are good. I think they're incredibly misleading, especially if you're looking at like traffic data from the LLM to your website, because the largest LLM, Google's AI overview, doesn't even exist in that traffic data. People are not clicking from the AI overview to your website. Look like when people book a demo or they purchase from you, ask them how they found out about you. So that self-reported attribution will actually be much more impactful in getting a better picture of how people are discovering you than looking at just search traffic today.
Absolutely. Okay, what's the biggest misconception SEO still have around brand mentions in AI search?
That they look at that, oh, like only 2% of traffic is coming from LLM, so this doesn't matter right now. I think that's just, SEO sticking their head in the sand and not looking at the big picture of where this market is going to go. Because once attribution is there, that number could be 30, 40% of purchases in the future.
If you could have one KPI or metric that would define GEO success, what would it be?
I think, and hopefully we get there, I think it has to be transactions. So if it's B2B, it's probably demos booked. If you're a B2C product, it has to be purchases. Like at the end of the day, that's all that matters because this is a marketing channel. And so while visibility is a kind of a nice like interim metric to have today, ultimately it's about the transaction. And I think we can get there.
Absolutely. All right, last question. Hopefully the easiest one for you, Rahul. Why should somebody try Noble?
If you want to show up in AI search, offsite is incredibly important. 95% of sources, especially for those mid-funnel prompts, are third-party sources. So if you're not mentioned in those sources, you're not going to show up in the answer.
Absolutely. Okay, and that wraps up this episode of the Voices of Search podcast. A huge thank you to Rahul Jain, CEO and co-founder at Noble, for joining us. If you'd like to contact Rahul, you can find a link to his LinkedIn profile in our show notes or on voicesofsearch.com. You can also visit his company website, that'snoble.com. If you haven't subscribed yet and want a daily stream of SEO and content marketing knowledge in your podcast feed, hit the subscribe button in your podcast app or on YouTube, and we'll be in your feed every week. Okay, that's all for today, but until next time, remember, the answers are always in the data.